Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
And under no circumstances would my father have sworn a new oath on the flag of the Federal Republic.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Please follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss a single episode. This is the story of a communist family in East Germany whose world was turned upside down by the implosion of the GDR. The story is told by Katja Hesse, whose father was a Vice Admiral in the Volksmarine, the East German Navy. Using her father's diaries, Katja shares in detail her memories and reflections from her father's shock upon learning she crossed into West Berlin to the complexities of navigating a new reality in a reunified Germany. It's an intimate glimpse into the struggles of her family as she recounts the legacy of the GDR and the profound impact it had on her upbringing and identity. I'm delighted to welcome Katja back to our Cold War conversation. Well, at some point you told your father, I mean, how did he react to the knowledge that you'd crossed into West Berlin?
Oh, yeah, that was something. You know, while we were all walking through West Berlin as if intoxicated, I had a lot of scary thoughts going through my head. And what if they close the border again and I can't return home? Can you imagine? This is like incredible. And I immediately thought of my father, and who was probably sitting in front of the TV at home and watching all the events, and for sure never even thinking that I could have joined the crowd going west. And I panicked and under no circumstances wanted to get into a situation that would have compromised my father. So I found a phone, both, and called my parents in the middle of the night from West Berlin. I guess it was around 2 o'clock in the morning. And I still remember exactly what I said. Daddy, guess where I am? I am in West Berlin. And my father was shocked and couldn't believe it. But at the moment he realized that Schabowski's statement became reality, and he begged me to be careful and return home quickly. And from today's perspective, I can very well imagine that he and my mother struggled with great fear. You have to be aware of the fact that my parents lived in the socialist system for over 40 years, learned that the West is an enemy that must be fought with all means. 40 years in times of the Cold War, you faced each other as enemies in the class struggle. 40 years, one stood for a system that simply disappeared overnight. How horrible must this have been for my dad? And how bitter to realize that everything you believed in and you were fighting for just fell apart in just one night. Only today I can understand what this must have meant to my father. It still makes me very, very sad. Very sad.
Katja, do you want to take a break there?
No, it's fine. I just need a little tissue here.
It's fine. It's fine.
You see that it's like touching me after 40 years or whatever. It's crazy. Okay. Good. I'm fine.
A question came to me whilst you were telling me that about your father, watching these events on TV. Did you watch West German TV at home?
No, not at all. Not at all. It was not allowed, and my father wouldn't have allowed it to, even if we would receive it. But no, there were no chance to watch it.
Because I just wondered how much East German TV was covering this. Were they covering it live in any way or not?
I think so. Yes. I'm pretty sure. Because I saw it in the news, and that's why I came to see it in real. I went to to my working place to see what's going on, because there was like bringing some stuff up in the news, but not really all. But later on, I was watching this in the TV for sure. Yeah, I can remember.
What did your father say about the vendor, the changes that then happened after the opening of the wall? How did he chronicle that?
Yeah, for many years, my father wrote everything down to the last details. And to read about his thoughts and feeling today on the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the socialist system is on one hand very sad, but is also very critical and honest reflection of the occurrences. And he didn't brag about anything. On the contrary, he was very self-critical actually, and questioned himself and his work. In 1989, he wrote, "After the fall of the Berlin Wall, events rolled over. The entire Politburo, that was the leadership elite under Honecker, resigned. The press was full of criticism attacks on members of the government, and the Brandenburg Gate was opened." Talking about the Brandenburg Gate, I have a unique memory of this state monument, I will tell you. I think at around the age of 12 or 13, my parents and I drove to Berlin for a long weekend. One evening, when it started to get dark in our capital, we drove in my father's car along the street under den Linden, leading directly to the Brandenburg Gate. And a little later, it appeared before our eyes, and we stood in front of the barrier, which was, of course, closely guarded by border guards holding rifles. And I was really excited to see what happened now. My father hadn't told us anything. The barrier opened, and we drove to the area in front of the gate. Simply stunning and unthinkable for the average GDR citizen. And we stopped right at the gate, and someone opened the door and made way for us. And a soldier saluted my father, and we were led into a room. We were in some kind of museum. And my father made it possible for us to visit the so-called Wall Museum directly at the Brandenburg Gate. And the officer on duty gave us a tour of the museum and explained to us how many soldiers had already lost their lives while on duty at the border. It was an unbelievable experience for me to be there in that place. Then we were brought directly outside, and I was allowed to look over the west at the Victory Column. It looked magnificent and golden in the evening light. I can remember. And on the other side of the wall, the west had put up a kind of viewing platform from which one could look over to the East German side. And you had the feeling you could almost reach over, and yet it felt that worlds separated our systems. And this experience was one of the most impressive in my life, and I will never forget this. And following the opening of the border, my father was confronted with a new reality and had to rethink and reconsider one or the other fact and gain new experiences. And one day he and my mother drove to Lübeck on the western side to see what they called the Wonderland. And there they were welcomed by organizers who, as my father writes, first gave my parents butter and other things. And my mother found this very embarrassing and disrespectful, as if we had no butter in the East. Yeah. And for my parents, it was a time filled with endless new impressions and learnings, positive as well as negative. And one expected sensation followed the others. Crazy, crazy times.
Seeing your country disappear and everything that you are used to and that you've grown up with disappear, and having to learn the Western way of life? Because you hear stories of unscrupulous people coming over from the West and selling things that aren't needed, insurances and all sorts of things. Then it must have been, like a minefield to just try and navigate your way through what was going on. Did you ever pick up your greetings money? Greetings money was 100 Deutschmarks payment to any East German who crossed into West Germany or West Berlin. It was a welcome gift from the West German government.
Yes, I did, actually. I did.
And where did you pick it up from, and what did you spend it on?
I picked it up in Berlin, actually, in a bank. I think it was the Deutsche Bank, the German bank. I can't really remember. Maybe it was also a different Sparkasse or something like this. And I bought for me a Discman. The thing, the Sony Discman. That was like for me, like I couldn't imagine ever to have something like this, and that was my wish to have. And then I bought toothpaste from Colgate.
Yeah.
Toothpaste. And I bought like a Casio watch, and I bought some sweets. So.
Yeah, you were obviously being seduced by the evil West there.
Yeah. But I think everyone in my friends' area, they all picked up the money. I can't remember anyone who doesn't pick up the money.
Do you mean, I'm presuming your father and mother thought we're not accepting Western money?
Yeah, I think in the beginning they were a little shy to do this, but I think they did it. I did it because just to like have an idea what you can buy, to go in the supermarket and see what kind of products they have and and that was also like everything was like a surprise to see what have the people in the West, what can we buy it, what can they buy. It was completely two different planets, like I said,
Katja, what was life like for your family with the GDR disappearing? There must have been some real challenges for them.
Yeah, there were generally very mixed feelings in our family, and we wanted actually to keep our GDR just like many others, but we also would be longing for a different and a better GDR, not just the westernization transfer of conditions from west to east, but this did not seem realistic. The West immediately got involved in the developments of the GDR. And no one in my extended family could predict what was coming for us. We were all facing an uncertain future. And my parents were confronted with many problems and challenges, but also restrictions, starting with the suspension of the honorary money for the Patriotic Order of Merit, which my father received in silver and bronze for his services to the country. It was also completely unclear of what would happen to the house in which my parents lived, as this was provided to my father due to his high function on the former GDR. And I have to add that my father was dismissed from active service in the People's Navy in 1988 due to health problems with his hip and was therefore in early retirement. And things which were all granted yesterday were all questioned at the blink of an eye, and everything was at risk of changing or disappearing today. And many political events came to a head in early 1990. New political groups were formed, and the Western regime continued to get involved and interfere in everything, including the upcoming election campaign. My brother, for example, was standing there with no future. He had become a professional officer out of conviction, and now the National People's Army was practically dissolved. The army let itself be politically put in a corner, and with a lack of leadership did not claim a role in Western armed forces. My brother was then at least able to do an apprenticeship as a driving instructor, but what was at risk to slowly slip into completely misery. For many of my father's friends, high-ranked, long and loyal officers, a world collapsed, and one of my father's best friends took his own life because of this. It goes without saying that a lot of human tragedies happened, and there wasn't a strong feeling that everything would feel great and everyone is happy about the new world order, and there was an enormous lack of empathy, as no one seemed interested in how the individuals behind this dramatic change felt.
It's difficult to imagine sort of being in that situation where all certainties are now very uncertain. Your brother never would have been interested in serving in the West German Navy?
No, not at all. There's no question about this, even my father. No, that was no point of discussion.
Mm-hmm. How did your father remember the first years of the fall of the wall? What did he write down?
In 1990, there were new elections, and my father was hoping for an improved, renewed GDR. There was a strong hope that the GDR would not suddenly turn overnight into a profit-driven Western market model, rather into a balanced and modestly changing system that combines social spirit with an open market, And one would very much hope that the GDR market economy, as we knew it from the West, would not prevail. This was, of course, quite an illusion, but the reality was all the more terrifying. This was when the introduction of the D-Mark was discussed. The fact that the CDU, that is the Christian Democratic Union Party, today the one of Friedrich Merz, of the Chancellor, won the elections, also surprised my father very much. It was clear to him that the new People's Government would do everything possible to join the Federal Republic as quickly as possible. Therefore, the end of the GDR was predictable to him, even through the approval of the Soviet Union and the other great powers was still uncertain. And however, my father had hoped that a union would take place in a moderate way. With a high pace, the system seemed to change. My parents faced more and more challenges, where they're allowed to stay in the house, for example, that the state had given them. What impact would a change from East to D-Mark have on their savings? And would they still be able to make a living? Questions about retirement were unanswered, and my parents were suddenly plagued by terrible existential fears. And their life as they knew it no longer existed. And when the monetary union came, the change from East to D-Mark, my father felt that this was the final proof he got that the Federal Republic had now taken over the GDR. My father followed closely what was happening politically during this time and couldn't believe what he witnessed day by day. With the change of the currency, my parents' wealth suddenly melted like snow under the sun, and their savings were a lot lower. And my father's retirement money was cut massively, and he had to learn bitterly how life could change without any wrongdoing. When Gorbachev negotiated with Kohl in the Caucasus about the extradition of the GDR to the Federal Republic without including the GDR in the talks, even bilateral assistance agreements existed. My father called this as one of the biggest disappointments of his life. And you have to recall that. Please understand that my father had been trained in the Soviet Union for over 7 years, and a large group of personal contacts in the Soviet fleet and mainly high-ranked officers had built up my father's conviction that the relationship between friendly socialist neighbors is guiding principle was one for all and all for one. This would hold on forever. And in the early years of the GDR's maritime protection, experienced Soviet officers helped as advisors in the build-up management and organizing of the fledgling fleet, sharing their wealth of experience and teaching helpful skills. These close cooperations formed the basis for solving the tasks set for the secure protection of the GDR. And it turned out, however, that this friendship wasn't worth a penny, and that Kohl's verbal promise to Gorbachev not to hold any surveillance of the GDR accountable was an absolutely lie. The many subsequent processes should prove this, and my father looked at his new life as it appeared to him as if he were part of a seriously bad movie. And the worst day for him was October 3rd, because as of this day, the NVA stopped existing, the army. The armed forces he had served all his life. It was taken into by the Bundeswehr without any respect for former GDR achievements. Believe me when I tell you that this was a massively bitter disappointment and personal defeat for my father. Until his last days in life, he said that this day of the German unification did not impress him at all, because it ended up in so many negative consequences and cuts in his personal life. And these changes caused a lot of stress and tensions in our family. And in the years up to 1992, the key question was, how will this all turn out for us?
I asked you earlier whether your brother might have served in the West German armed forces. How did your father feel about Admiral Hoffman continuing to serve after the Wende? Because your family was very close to Hoffman's.
Yeah, we were. My father and Theodor Hoffman had a creative and fruitful collaboration for over 40 years during the longest period of peace in Europe. And in 1987, Theodor Hoffman was appointed chief of the Volksmarine after Admiral Ehm was dismissed from active service. And my father had been struggling with health problems for a long time and was released from active service in 1988 for early retirement. And from today's point of view, I am really happy about it. Firstly, because the time that followed for him after active duty was very difficult. Secondly, when the unification treaty became public, it was clear that my father would anyway have been dismissed, and under no circumstances would my father have sworn a new oath on the flag of the Federal Republic. And after the fall of the wall in 1990, my father, Admiral Ehm, Hoffman, and others were, of course, still in close contact. And during these days, many changes were taking place in the People's Navy. Old stuff were replaced, and there were strong calls for military reform. My father thought rearrangement and reforms were right, but in the end, he was only able to find out this from a distance, and he was not in a position to make a clear judgment on many questions. To lead an armed force under these circumstances was also an enormous challenge for Theodor Hoffmann. Just think how great the hesitation of the members of the army and professional officers about their future fate must have been when the new government under de Maizière took office. It was clear that the next step would lead to the unification of the two German states and also to the elimination of the National People's Army. And I don't know to what extent my father and Admiral Hoffman were able to exchange ideas about the situation. After all, my father lived in Rostock and Admiral Hoffman did his duty in Berlin and Strausberg. But I'm sure that my father knew exactly how Admiral Hoffman took his decisions after careful consideration with a high sense of duty and in the interest of the soldiers of the National People's Army. With a heavy heart, Admiral Hoffman accepted the nomination of the new Prime Minister of the German Democratic Republic, Lothar de Maizière, to take over the office of the head of the NVA. But he knew that this command came at a significant price. He took this from his own sense of responsibility towards the soldiers of the National People's Army, which up to now performed their duty and which now faced an uncertain future. And in order to be able to continue the new cooperation with the Western armed forces of the USSR as smoothly as possible, as always in his long service in the naval forces. In this case, too, he put personal interest aside and did his duty in the National People's Army. My father could only respect this and pay tribute to Admiral Hoffman. That's what I think.
So what you're saying there is Hoffman decided to take the post that de Maizière had offered him in order that the NVA had somebody who would support them as much as possible during this transition period, who was a name that the NVA were familiar with and who they could trust.
Yeah, I think so. It's Admiral Hoffman was the only choice they had. There was no other officer actually in duty to handle all this stuff. That's why I remember the rare Admiral Herbert Bernig told me once that there were a discussion between the Admiral Ehm and Hoffman and my father and somebody else. And Admiral Ehm told Admiral Hoffman to take this position. He said exactly, you have to do this because no one other can do this right now. So please do it. Because Admiral Hoffman was not sure if he actually couldn't handle the whole stuff, But Admiral Ehm said, you should do this and you have to do this. That's what I heard,
Yeah, and I guess from Hoffman's point of view, he's got a fear that he's going to be thought of as a traitor.
Of course.
For doing this.
Yeah.
But really, really, really fascinating insight there into that. I mean, how did things change for you and your family in the immediate years after the reunification of Germany?
Yeah, I mean, our family was also confronted with many problems and pressures. And I moved to Switzerland in 1990, and I was about to get married, but my family had to struggle heavily with the consequences of the fall of the wall. Since my brother and my brother-in-law were both professional officers, they lost their roles when the GDR was taken over by the Federal Republic. And of course, this hit their women particularly hard, my sister and sister-in-law, who both had to carry the entire financial burdens for their families, while both men tried to find work. And my fiancé at the time, who was Swiss, started doing business with exposing them to free Western markets. And suddenly my brother and brother-in-law were supposed to be working on a commission basis, selling insurance for him, something they did not have a clue about. And this should now be the foundation for their family income, And it was naive to believe that. But they certainly were hoping that the future new family member, my future husband, would treat them fair, as they knew this from past experience in the GDR. And unfortunately, it was not like this at all. My brother, as well as my brother-in-law, went into financial problems to keep up with the capitalist market economy. And this, in turn, caused major arguments in our family. In addition, my mother often had heart problems, and the entire unsafe situation also bothered my parents very much. The retirement money was cut to a minimum, and my father, as an admiral off duty, would normally have received a very high retirement benefit, but he was cut back, and the government of the Federal Republic simply set him to a minimum and did not recognize my father's service to the GDR nor to existence of the army. And many high-ranking admirals objected to this and fought in a long court proceeding, unfortunately unsuccessful. And another burden for my parents was the housing situation. They were still fighting for registration in the land registry of the city of Rostock, and my parents had to buy the house twice. The first time on the basis of the GDR law, but when the GDR was history, the federal government said this purchase was illegal and missed any legal basis and ordered my parents to make a second purchase of the property, which almost drove my parents to financial ruin, because the house had aged over the years and needed urgent renovation, as you can understand. And if my brother hadn't helped massively with his handyman skills, I don't know how things would have gone from there. And it wasn't until 1998 that my parents got the registration in the land registry. So a struggle for years came to an end. I was only noticing their struggle from distance in Switzerland, as my parents didn't want to bury me. And I didn't really understand how or get a clear picture of the situation until years later. The saddest thing I noticed in this context was that my father had to sell a very meaningful coin collection that he had collected over many years, as well as a complete set of his uniform. At the time, the demand for such things in the West was enormous, and my father struggled with himself for a long time. But the financial squeeze led him with no other choice,
How was your father treated after the Wende? So basically, he was getting the minimum West German pension.
Yes. Yeah, I'm blessed that I can learn most things that happened in the years after the fall of the wall in our family chronicles that my father documented very well. And my father wrote down his thoughts and impressions in the form of a diary in great detail to paper. And after the turnaround in the mid-90s, I found a note that my father wrote for a meeting in Stralsund to former officers of the People's Navy. He wrote, "I'm happy to see many friends again, and that's why I came. I can't give an extensive answer to questions of how I am and what I'm doing today. I live a normal retirement life. I am a person affected by penal law, isolated by being close to the state, who has served in a foreign army and is recognized as disabled. Overall, I have the attitude that I stand by what I have done because I did it out of conviction, even if from today's perspective, you may have done it a lot differently. I am thinking about a lot of problems. Why was the Cold War lost? Why did the Soviet Union let us down in 1990? I cannot hide my disappointment with the Soviet Union. I also try to come to terms with the past. I served the GDR state out of complete conviction. But still, you also need to critically reflect on your own work. This makes it very clear to me that my father never received the recognition and respect which he would have deserved. And every admiral who retired in the Federal Republic could be sure that his work and his service time were recognized accordingly, even if it was only secured by a good retirement money. My father, on the other hand, as well as Admiral Aim and many others, were disgraced by penalties, by denial of their functions in the armed forces, as well as prosecuted and denounced through criminal trials for years. This is where the bitter truth shows itself for me. Even then, 7 years after the fall of the wall, the East-West split was deeper than ever, and my father wrote in 97, everything is the same. There is a lot of talk about reforms, but nothing happens. Chancellor Kohl has become so arrogant that he does not allow any criticism of what he is doing. Unemployment is rising and is above 20% in the eastern countries. The trials against border soldiers are to be continued, and the GDR is to be branded as an injustice state, and the Federal Republic is to be seen as das Wunderland, the Wonderland. The criminal pension law will continue to apply and much more. And in 2000, my father wrote in the Chronicle, for me, the attitude of the federal government not to eliminate penalties remains negative. 10 years after reunification, we are still treated as second-class citizens. And this realization of my father makes me also very, very sad.
In that note that you read that he wrote for a meeting with former officers of the Volksmarine, the last line where he says, but still you also need to critically reflect on your own work. What was he meaning by that?
Of course, he questioned himself when the whole country disappeared. I think he questioned himself. Did I do something wrong, or could I have do something better? I think he was questioning himself a lot. And of course, if he would be still alive, I would ask him about this. But I'm also glad that he at least left me some kind of thoughts of him that makes me like thinking about what he means with it. But, I can't really answer this question. I can only guess. And I think my father was so in a disappointment that he had to reflect his work, and maybe he thought that he did something wrong, but I'm not sure about really.
Yeah, it's an interesting phrase to have there, because one way you could read that is he's looking at the GDR and what was revealed around, I don't know, corruption and the other side of the GDR, which many people are critical of, and which perhaps a lot of people weren't aware of when they lived in the GDR, but it was revealed at a later date, the doping of the athletes, for example, the drugging of athletes to win gold medals, the homes that some children were put into in East Germany, and those other things. I don't know. It sort of can read a number of ways, and obviously we'll never know there. But it's a really interesting line that there is there. And for you, Katja, what was it like for you to have your country disappear overnight?
Yeah, from today's perspective, with all the knowledge that I have gained, including the knowledge of the fate that has happened in our family, and the realization is actually a very bitter one. And the crisis in the GDR showed itself as a slow and creeping process, which resulted in the opening of the border under the pressure of the people, And I was born in the GDR and grew up there and spent a wonderful childhood there. And for me, the GDR was the definition of home and the same haven, And as life went on, my path lead me to Switzerland, which I never really planned. I was very young, just turned 20, and I had the feeling that when the borders opened, the world was ready for me in all its diversity and colors. And that was, of course, a different basis at the time than if I had stayed in the GDR. And being in Switzerland, I was only able to follow the whole development from a distance. And some experiences were told to me by my family, and others passed by me completely. And what my parents went through, and especially how my father felt after seeing the state disappear after 40 years, which he had dedicated his entire life to, I only came to realize many years later. And I wish if I had more insight of the worries of my family. However, they tried to protect me by not burdening me with what was happening. And my parents visit me regularly in Switzerland, but problems were never discussed and everything should be in harmony, And today I often think that I should have challenged difficult conversations more often in order to understand my father better and what he was going through. And much did not become clear to me until after his death in 2001, when I took over his diaries and naval notes. And today I'm infinitely grateful that I have these documents, and I consider them to be very precious. And at the age of 55, already, and I can now understand so many things better and differently. And I wish I had more time to have exciting conversations with my father. It's been 35 years since the Berlin Wall came down, and with all the knowledge that I have gained of the past, I think it's a tragic event in German history that a state like the GDR was simply crossed off the map. But in the end, which nation can claim to have not made mistakes, And there were definitely things that were wrong and not glorious. But to rob people of their homeland, that was wrong in my opinion. And the jubilation about the reunification was great. But today many people I know speak of the fact that they miss the GDR in many ways. But this is a different story for a different podcast episode.
Yeah. We've talked about what happened to your family and what happened to you. Did you get any indication what had happened to other families who were party loyalists?
Yeah, most of the people in our private network were, of course, loyal party members of the SED. Even after the fall of the wall, many stayed loyal to the party, which of course did not go down well with the general public. And many of the old comrades were publicly insulted as pretentious big shots and punished with disrespect. And the consequences for the families of former members of the National People's Army were grave. Most of the professional soldiers were left with nothing after their release, and there were hardly any positions that matched the qualifications of the professional soldiers. And the consequences amounted to a punishment that the families also had to bear. I felt it very strongly in April 1994 when charges were brought against Admiral Ehm. He was accused of being a partner in crime in the incidents on the border with the Federal Republic as a member of the Minister Board of the GDR. And my father immediately offered Admiral Ehm his help and support, and consequently they sat together a lot with a lawyer that Admiral Ehm had to engage. And the development of the struggle for the house in which my parents lived was also tragic. As before, my parents, as well as Admiral Ehm and others who lived in the army settlement, were refused entry in the land register, which was necessary to buy the house. And in 1998, there were disputes with the CDU and the Party of the Greens. My father then found out that a huge disturbance had been staged since 1990 to prevent any state-affiliated officer from buying anything there. Everyone who was once on the Admiralty staff was removed from their homes. Exhausting legal disputes took 8 years. Really 8 long years. And perhaps you can imagine how difficult these years must have been for people like my parents and other admirals. And 8 years after the fall of the wall, my father's conclusion was, nothing has changed. The East-West division has deepened, and the discrimination of all departments of the GDR army continues. My father was punished for his principles for a peaceful homeland for 40 years. He had to witness firsthand the breakup of the socialism,
Do you stay in touch with anyone from your school days? I think you mentioned earlier that there's one person that you're still in touch with.
Yes, I do. I have a really good friend from my school days with whom I have been friends which since the second grade, and who has kept me company over all these years. And I can always count on them and can call them actually at any hour if I have a problem, and they would be there for me in a second. And such friendships are very important to me, and I have had many friends over the years. But in the end, there are only a few left that actually stayed. And it's also very nice when you know each other for such a long time and have stuck together through thick and thin. And we have also met regularly in Leipzig. Usually the entire former staff of the guest house is invited, and we talk about good old times and different memories we shared. And Erich Honecker was a regular guest, as I told you, before of the government guest house in Leipzig. And a few years ago, there was a meeting in Leipzig at the guest house where they shoot a documentary about him, and we as a former employees were invited and interviewed. And do you know what was the most shocking thing? In the end, the documentary was cancelled because our display of the events was far too positive. This is crazy. Our memories were too good for them. They wanted to hear the bad things and how bad everything was. And that's exactly what I mean. Nobody was or is interested in positive propaganda. No one wants to hear about the good times. And now that we didn't just sit there crying and were unhappy, that doesn't fit into the image of the wrongful state of the GDR, This is really crazy.
Looking back, what would you say was your father's greatest accomplishment?
I would have liked to ask this question my father in person, as you can imagine, and so much that moves and interests me today would have been an exciting basis for a discussion. And my father loved to discuss or tell anecdotes, and you could sit with my father all night and talk about the world. And of course, we had a vodka or two. And I miss that very much, I must say. And I think that it filled him with great pride that he was able to work with the naval forces. There have been many great successes in his life that he could look back on, that he achieved either alone or together with his colleagues. And the first great success was that he was able to attend the first special course for officers of the maritime police in the Soviet Union in Königsberg, and he graduated with honors. This qualification enabled him to take on important leadership roles in the first flotilla of the maritime police. And the second great success was that as a young officer at the age of 32, he became the chief of the 6th Flotilla, which was appointed the flotilla of the trust forces of the People's Navy. And at the age of 38, he was appointed Rear Admiral. At this time, he was the youngest admiral in the GDR. And the third major visible success was the appointment as Deputy Chief of the People's Navy and Chief of Staff. And my father always carried out all the assigned tasks with great strength and passion. And for this, he received a lot of recognition, both from his superiors and from his subordinates. And he could also count that among his great successes. And as long as there was the National People's Army and the Warsaw Treaty Alliance, there was peace in Europe, and I see having played an important role in this as his greatest success. That's my opinion.
Is there anything you miss about the GDR?
Oh, yes, I miss the joyful and easygoing times, and growing up in the GDR was wonderful for me to be sheltered, protected, and of course privileged. And when we were sick, we could go to the doctor without hesitation and didn't have to worry about the costs, which is of course a complete illusion in today's world. Not everything was bad in the GDR. It would have been nice if it could have been improved. So a new GDR 2.0, for example, and perhaps a lot of human tragedies and fates that occurred with the disappearance of our country could have been prevented. And history is always made by the winners. And unfortunately, it wasn't us,
You mentioned you ended up in Switzerland, but we didn't sort of have the backstory there. How did that come about?
Yes, that's right. And this is probably one of the things that I couldn't have imagined in my wildest dreams as a young teenager. And just imagine my father, an admiral of the GDR, under no circumstances could I have asked him for permission to go to Switzerland, because this would have immediately ruined and ended my father's entire career. Many people still ask me today whether I ever felt the need to flee or to leave the GDR, and my answers to this is still crystal clear no. I didn't miss anything or was in some way restricted in my way of life at the time. Of course, I was only 19. But anyway, the day the Berlin Wall fell, of course, moved a lot of people all over the world, and most of them experienced this on television. But there were also people who were in West Berlin at exactly that time. And 2 days after the great historical event, the two Swiss brothers ran into the Grand Hotel as they wanted to get an idea of what was happening on site. The two Swiss guys sat down in my area, and so it happened that I fell in love with one of him. And in March the following year, in 1990, he invited me to Switzerland. And now the rest of this is a story. I don't know if I mentioned before that I wrote down in my book an autobiography of my life that was published in 2020. I felt very much at home in Switzerland for a good 35 years. It has become a second home for me. Of course, the early years were very difficult as I was separated from my family, exposed to a capitalist market economy system, and as a former East German, almost an exotic type of woman. You can't imagine with what kind of crazy beliefs about the East I had to fight with. But all of this has made me who I am today. And my Eastern identity and what my father has left behind, I will never deny. On the contrary, it is important to me, belongs to me, and I'm very proud of it.
There's one thing that you almost said it as almost like a passing comment, that you were very close to Egon Krenz. In fact, you still see him. How did that connection happen? And you must have a few stories about that.
Oh, yeah, I have. Yeah, the Egon Krenz story is actually very, very funny and very nice. And of course, I have some memories, memorable memories of Egon Krenz in my life. I have one I wrote down in my book. I will explain it to you. And I was in training at the guest house in Dierhagen, and I normally served the Krenz family, whether for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And one morning, the Krenz family came for breakfast, and I was chosen to serve them. And it was the year 1989, and at that time, no one could have known that Egon Krenz would, a year later, succeed Erich Honecker as General Secretary and Chairman of the State Council of the GDR, even if only for 7 weeks, And Egon's son looked at me as I approached the table and loudly said to his father and mother, "You are the woman I will marry someday." And Egon Krenz was visibly amused by this, while his wife Erika looked a little shocked, and I was, of course, very embarrassed by the whole situation. And I ran away from the table and couldn't help but smile a little. So,
did you know Egon Krenz's son was?
Yes, sure. We were actually a couple for a couple of months. So I mean, he was in love with me. So and he wanted actually to be together with me, like as a couple. And that's why I know Egon so well. And sometime later, my father received an award at the State Council building in Berlin, which was presented to him by Egon Krenz. And Egon Krenz approached my father and said loudly and clearly to him, "Ah, you are Katja's father. I am very pleased," and congratulated him on receiving the award. And my father came home and didn't quite know how to tell me about it, but he was visibly impressed by the circles I moved in. And even today, Egon Krenz and I remain friends. We sometimes meet at events, or I also congratulate him every year on his birthdays. This year he turned 89, and funny enough, 3 weeks ago I invited him for a boat trip in my hometown, and he gratefully accepted, and he came along. And my friends and I spent 1.5 hours sailing with Egon on a beautiful boat across the Baltic waters. And when he left, he hugged me warmly, and it felt just as if I were hugging my own father. Very warm and very heartfelt.
Wow. So it begs the question, do you think Egon would want to come on Cold War Conversations?
I will try my best, dear Ian, to make this happen. When I can send him this episode, and maybe he can listen to it, and then I can maybe ask him if he is fancy to sit down with you and do an interesting interview. We will work on this.
Yeah. Okay.
That's
okay.
A good challenge.
Well, that would be amazing. That's given me an incentive to edit this quite quickly. Then,
yeah.
to get this ready quite quickly.
Yeah. For sure.
I'm very much looking forward to listening back to this.
And Egon always, that's also funny when he is meeting some people from the Navy still today, and they're sitting on the table, and for some reason comes my name up, and he always said, "Oh, Katja, I would have loved to have her as my daughter-in-law," or how you said it?
Yeah.
Daughter-in-law. Yeah, he's always saying this, and people texting me and say, "Oh, Katja, you know what Egon has told just here on the table. He likes you so much, and he is so sad about that you are not married with his son. And I'm like, okay, to know. It's so funny, I tell you.
Brilliant.
And maybe it would be happen if there was not something other happen in history, Who knows?
Yeah, if the wall hadn't have come down, who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Maybe I would not sit with you today here and talking about this.
The episode extras, such as videos, photos and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.